Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, how are you doing?
I'm very well, Michael. Very happy to be joining you this Friday from a room which doesn't look like a squat, which is what my bedroom looked like last week. I make apologies for that, but yes, very happy.
I said it looked like a prison, and then lots of people in the comments were speculating that I'd really annoyed you. People always think that we've fallen out when we haven't, but even if we look like we're disagreeing with each other, me and Aaron Bastani are the best of friends. Don't you ever worry about that, even if his bedroom does look like a prison. Coming up on tonight's show, global temperatures in 2024 passed 1.5 degrees. We'll speak to climate scientist Dr. Ella Gilbert about what that means. And we'll look into Elon Musk's allies within the far right and the real reason, or what might be the real reason, he wants to disrupt European politics. Is it because of ideology, or is it because of money and business interests? Stay tuned for all of that. And as ever, make sure to let us know your comments on YouTube Super Chat, or you can tweet us on the hashtag Novara Live. At the start of Israel's war on Gaza, there was a big row in the West about whether media outlets should trust casualty figures from the Gaza Ministry of Health. As the confirmed death toll of the war went from 10,000 to 20,000 to 30,000, critics claimed the toll was being inflated, and mainstream outlets were pressured into always using the somewhat awkward formulation, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health, which is controlled by Hamas, every time they said how many people had died. Now, this was always a fairly spurious concern. Given Israel had blocked international journalists, there was no other way to get death figures than from the health ministry. And in all previous conflicts, the death tolls, as reported by the health ministry, had matched subsequent analyses by independent organizations like the UN. But the row continued nonetheless. Well, now it turns out that not only were those claims about deaths being inflated wrong, they had in fact got the reality precisely the wrong way round. That's according to a new peer-reviewed study published today in the UK's most prestigious medical journal, The Lancet. The study is by researchers at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and it finds that between October 2023 and June 2024, 64,000 Palestinians were violently killed in Gaza, which is 41% higher than the figures from the Gaza Health Ministry at the time. Now, the study estimates that 59% of these deaths were of women, children, and the elderly, and they say they believe 3% of Gaza's population had been killed by that point. What's more, the study suggested it is likely the death toll from other war-related causes, for example, because of the collapsed medical system, is much higher than the figures they have arrived at. It's an incredibly sobering report, and it's been picked up widely. Al Jazeera published the story, as you'd expect, but so did Reuters and CNN, which is significant because these are outlets that would have often sort of used the language of the Gaza Health Ministry, which is controlled by Hamas. As I say, spurious at the time and now shown to be completely back to front. To find out more about this, earlier today I spoke to the study's lead author, Zaina Jamaluddin. Zaina is an assistant professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I began by asking her to explain the study's main findings.
In terms of the key findings, what the study actually shows is that the mortality that's been reported by the Ministry of Health in Gaza from October 7 till June 30 is an underreport of around 40%. So the Ministry of Health was saying that the mortality is around 37,000 that were killed in Gaza, whereas in fact it might be actually till June that the mortality was 64,000. And we've used statistical methods to come up with these estimations.
I mean, I understand these things are very complicated, but sort of in layman's terms, could you explain what those statistical methods were? How did you come to this estimate?
We relied on different listings to come up with these estimates. So we had at the beginning the hospital listings, so the number and names of people who were coming into hospitals and died, or bodies were available. They had the name, they had the age of the person that was killed, they had the national ID of the person, and these formed a hospital list that the Ministry of Health in Gaza relies on to come up with estimates of mortality. We then, because of the attacks on hospitals that happened, we know that the reporting from these hospitals became less and less reliable. And we then also relied on another list that was the survey list. People report in a survey that a relative or a brother or a father passed away. And then we also had a third list that was the social media list. The social media list relied on mortalities reported by family and friends as in social media posts, so using images and pictures of where the person was killed, the name of the person, the age of the person. So first of all, we have all of these three distinct lists: the hospital list, the survey list, and the social media list. And the idea behind the capture-recapture method is that we look at the overlap between these lists. So we clean each list separately, and then we look at this person is overlapped in how many lists. And based on the amount of overlap, we can estimate the total mortality in Gaza. And these methods have been used in different war settings, but also by ecologists to come up with populations of, for example, fish or insects in different areas, but also later on used by different researchers to come up with disease numbers, but also mortality estimation in Kosovo, in Colombia, in Guatemala, in Yemen, in Sudan, and different type of war and or violence context. And the idea behind it, and I don't want to simplify at all by saying that, but I find people understand the idea when I mention this, is that if you have a pond and you have fish in the pond, that you want to determine the number of the population of fish, you would capture one day a sample, and then you would tag the sample with a red dot. The next day, you would release them back. The next day, you would recapture. And based on the amount of the sample the next day, how many had the same dot and the red dot. And the idea behind it is that if you the next day you're going to recapture a number that had actually a lot of fish with red dots, that means that the total population is actually small. But if you capture less fish with red dot, that means the population is actually bigger. And this is the idea that comes behind these methods of capture, recapture. Of course, I'm super simplifying this, and just to give the concept of where it came from, we've used the different methods to do this, to do these estimation, and this is a way to try to explain that we're looking at three lists, and we see the overlaps between the lists. If the overlap depends on how much the overlap it is, we can figure out the number of unidentified peoples. So people we do not have the names of. And that gives us the mortality in Gaza.
So say, for example, if the Gaza Ministry of Health had said 40,000, and then you have this list of people you're sure who have died because of social media, and if you find that only, or you've got this list of people who you're sure died on social media and only half of them are recorded in the Gaza Ministry of Health figures, then in crude terms, you can basically say, well, if the Gaza Ministry of Health figures is only capturing half of the people who've died, then we can double the Gaza Ministry of Health figures. Now, I know that's not what you've done, because that would be grossly simplifying, but that's the logic. Am I correct?
This is the logic behind it, but that also is why we use three lists. And that's why also we adjust for different elements. And we have used 4 different statistical methods in the appendix that people are willing if they want to see them. But the concept behind it is exactly what you said.
I know your study, I mean, it's a shocking number as it is, but you're clear that you've only captured a limited number of the people who will have died in Gaza, because you're looking specifically at people who've died from traumatic injuries, so people who will have died a violent death, so by gun wounds or by a bombing or by a building collapsing. And you're clear that there may be many more people who have died from other war-related causes, so say a lack of medical health because a hospital has been bombed, or I suppose a lack of food or a lack of clean water or disease spreading. Do you have any idea of what the real number of sort of war-related deaths could be in Gaza?
So first of all, I also want to say that our estimate, as you mentioned, is traumatic death. But in the survey list, there was a question about whether the person is missing. So if a person is reported by family and members that they were killed, or they're under the rubble, or they're killed, we included these individuals. But if a person is reported as missing, so let's say they are detained, okay, or they are missing within the Gaza Strip, we cannot find them. We did not include them, but these individuals might also be killed. And so we only relied on data that was said that individuals have said that these individuals were killed in Gaza. And we excluded those that were reported as missing. So that might mean that our numbers are a bit of an underreporting. The other estimate is that the other estimate of the underreporting might, as you mentioned, be the non-traumatic death. Our estimate might also include some non-traumatic death, and we've outlined that because the causes of death are not always mentioned. However, today, coming up with estimates of total mortality from different causes of death, whether infectious diseases, NCDs, maternal care not being able to access care, we've attempted to do something in February to come up with these estimates in terms of projections. So what would be in case of an escalation? However, you would need proper methods of surveys to go to today in the field and assess these mortality. And this is definitely not the priority in Gaza. The priority is to make sure food and medicine is going in, and doing mortality estimation surveys is not the priority of the UN agencies. And so, and ethically, honestly, I would question, but I would say that the number could be higher. It's just by how much higher, this is the question. And it's hard to apply things that happened in other settings to this setting. So I think it's important to keep in mind that we had very low numbers of infectious diseases in Gaza. There was no epidemics until like recently we've seen polio. And so the numbers might increase with polio mortality. We've seen malnutrition. However, the numbers of malnutrition has not reached yet levels that we've seen in Sudan and other conflict settings that are very scary, but they are increasing. So malnutrition in Gaza was 1% before the war. Today, in some areas, it's between 10 and 15%. So in fact, we've seen malnutrition, but what we see in Sudan is around 35, or not generalizing all of Sudan, yeah, but giving different estimates that you can see in different areas. But what I want to say is that mortality from the indirect effects is increasing, and possibly a lot from non-communicable diseases. So a person has a heart attack and cannot access healthcare, and these have long-term effects, not only today on mortality now. And so it's hard to apply some sort of factors to come up with what is the indirect effect. What I want to end up with all of this to say is the aim of this was to actually say that the numbers reported by the ministry are an underreporting, and to showcase what we currently have based on the evidence we have. But hopefully we could one day have a ceasefire soon, to be able and to get access and to medication and to food and different humanitarian services within Gaza, but also maybe come up with proper estimations of mortality. Sorry, it's a very long answer to that question, but I know everyone wants to know what is the number. And I think for me, the number is already high. The number is very high. And putting a number on it, and that was the point of this writing this, is to say it is higher than we think. And it's higher than it's being reported than the ministry. But it's also, what we're also saying is there is also higher than that.
I completely get that. And I want to sort of say, I know I'm talking to you here as a scientist, not as a campaigner or a politician, but I suppose, do you have a sense of what you think is the significance of sort of people knowing the number of people who've died? Because, you might look at sort of debate on this and say either, people are on this side where they say this is Hamas's fault and however many Palestinians die, don't blame the Israelis. And then other people who say that the Israelis killing Palestinians is wrong, whatever Hamas is. You don't want to say there's sort of a political narrative that people have in their heads. And whether it's 40,000 or 60,000 or 80,000 people who've been dead. I mean, do you think that sort of knowledge or estimates or sort of projections about the number of people who've been killed or injured or affected, do you think that does have sort of political impact and political importance?
Well, you're asking me the question that I ask myself every day. I think that it's important for accountability of what's happening in Gaza, proper documentation of what's happening. The narrative that, oh, the Ministry of Health is reporting these numbers, and then at the beginning we showed that the numbers were correct, and then the systems collapsing because of attacks on hospitals and because of wars, systems and health information systems degrade. And this questioning, like, the numbers from the ministry, because they were saying this many were unidentified. We wanted to, an scientific exercise to show how many the unidentified was, for accountability purposes of what's happening in Gaza, and documentation that this aspect happen in wars. In terms of how this is used or not used, or what you've mentioned, I think different wars have, and mortality estimation have been used in different ways. I think pictures of kids dying and the very high mortality rates among children has been documented from the beginning of the war. And this is not the first time that's been said in this report. And so, and what we say is what the UN has said, what Air Wars has done is in a great investigation where they also show mortality that's happening at the beginning of the war. And I advise people to also look at the Air Wars investigation that they've done. But to say that how all of that could be used today for me is an accountability, a push. But sadly, the narrative in different people's heads, I don't know what can change the narratives, because people have made up their minds about it in different ways. And it's a bit discouraging, to be honest, to see how different lives are treated differently. When we talk about 3%, then that means like we're talking about 1 in 35 people in Gaza. If you know 30, like this is the huge death toll in Gaza. And I don't know, I am not a politician, but I'm hoping that these can provide more evidence into the very high mortality rate compared to different places, and see how much this was and how was the conduct of this war in Gaza.
That was Assistant Professor Zaina Jamaluddin from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine speaking to me earlier today. Elon Musk isn't just obsessed with the UK, but the whole of Europe. And after 9 days of spreading misinformation here about grooming gangs and Tommy Robinson, he's turned his attention to Germany. And there are no prizes for guessing who he's allied with there. Yes, Elon is a big fan of the far-right Alternative for Deutschland, or AfD. And on Thursday this week, he hosted their leader on an X live feed. Now, the AfD is a very extreme party. In January last year, it was revealed that senior party leaders had met with neo-Nazi influencers to discuss the mass deportation of people with immigrant backgrounds, even if they had residency rights or citizenship. And the scandal showed them to be so extreme that even Marine Le Pen distanced herself from the party. So they were too extreme for the national rally in France. She's saying, oh, actually, even this is a bit too much for me. And senior AfD figures have also been fined for using Nazi slogans, which is illegal in Germany. Bjorn Höcke, who is a co-founder of the party and its leader in Thuringia, was fined for encouraging an audience to chant "Everything for Germany," which is an SS slogan. But in Thursday's conversation with Elon Musk, current party leader Alice Weidel went to great lengths to try and rewrite the nature of Germany's Nazi past.
Back then, during the Third Reich, the National Socialists, as the word says, they were socialists.
Yeah,
Adolf
very much
Hitler
so. They nationalized industries like crazy.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
He was a communist, and he considered himself as a socialist. So what they did, they state funded then the private companies, and then they asked for taxes, huge taxes. And then also, wait a second, I need to ask the word now, verstaatlichen? nationalize the entire industry. You said that before, and the biggest success after that terrible era in our history was to label Adolf Hitler as right and conservative. He was exactly the opposite. He wasn't a conservative. He wasn't a libertarian. He was a communist, socialist guy.
Yeah.
So full stop, no more comment on that.
Now, Aaron, later in this segment, I'm going to look at sort of a variety of reasons why Elon Musk might be allying with the AfD. I thought I'd go to you first, though, just to respond to that claim that actually Hitler was communism's problem. He was a communist.
What a stupid comment to make. A stupid person. What a ridiculous, idiotic series of words we just subjected our audience and viewers to, Michael. Where to begin? I mean, the AfD are very, very bad people. They're bad news. And you mentioned the Le Pen point, and that's a really, really critical one. The AfD are actually in their own grouping in the European Parliament. They are not with the likes of Le Pen. They are with a Bulgarian ultra-nationalist party. They are with the party of Eric Zemmour, Reconquête. So they are too far right for Fidesz and for the most right-wing ultra-nationalist parties in Europe. They are further to the right of those guys. They're very, very right-wing. You know, Musk has this line, doesn't he? He says, well, I like this person. You know, Trump is like Obama in 08. I mean, presumably the AfD, they're no different to Obama in 08. But the debates move so far to the left now, you know, AfD are like Obama with hope and change. And, 16 years ago, they would have been pals. I don't think so. So that's the point about AfD and their political background and complexion. In terms of whether or not Hitler was a communist, Dachau, which is the very first concentration camp. By the way, this borders. We're getting now, I think, quite close to genocide denial. Right? If you start to say, well, actually, Hitler was left wing. Dachau, the very first concentration camp, was built for political prisoners who were, guess what, left wing. National Socialists, the NSDAP. It's in the name. Well, then presumably you think that the Democratic Republic of Congo under Kabila, well, they were democratic. It said it in the name. What a stupid way of thinking. Just ridiculous. That first concentration camp, Dachau, like I say, opened in 1933 for political prisoners, included many people from the criminalized, the banned Communist Party. Eventually, it would include many trade unionists. Of course, the Nazi Party didn't permit trade unions. So I don't quite understand where you get the idea that they're left wing. You know, Hitler, time after time in Mein Kampf, talks about the enemy being Marxism, Judeo-Bolshevism, how the forces of the Marxist left are destroying the nation. For Hitler, the idea of class and race were intertwined. He viewed, for instance, that he viewed the state as the expression of racial solidarity amongst ethnic Germans. That in no way is coterminous with ideas about socialism. You know, they were trying to generate a unique, sui generis political movement. And of course, Germany before the emergence of Nazism had an incredibly successful left-wing political history. The SDP, which still exists today, one of the parties in the German government, is one of the oldest left-wing parties in Europe. In fact, I believe Friedrich Engels helped to set it up. Goodness knows what he'd make of Olaf Scholz. But they had a very storied history, influencing, the debate with regards to Bismarck and so on. Bismarck gives all kinds of concessions, effectively a protean welfare state in the newly reunified Germany, because they're worried about the uptick in political success that's coming from the SDP. You, of course, get later on the KPD, the actual Communist Party, very, very powerful movements. And so Hitler and his faction within the Nazi Party, and there was a debate about all of this stuff, make the decision to appropriate the language, but to really hammer even the left within their own political party. Forget the socialists and the communists out there. When you get the Enabling Act, the Communist Party isn't there, like I say. This is before actually they're prohibited. Many of them are on the run. Many of them subsequently end up in prison. So this idea that they're communists and socialists is just so idiotic that, like I say, it borders on a form of historical denialism, which I think is deeply disingenuous. Like I say, these were the very first people in concentration camps in 33. After 35, you start to get people from other groups, but between 33 and 35, almost entirely, the people in Dachau would have been on the left, trade union activists. Disgusting, frankly.
I mean, it is disgusting. I mean, to use such a crass argument as, that they were called the National Socialists, so they're socialists. I mean, you went to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Of course, you could also talk about the GDR, the German Democratic Republic. You should ask, or Elon Musk, if he was a little bit smarter, could have asked the lady from the AfD, which was the democratic one, West Germany or East Germany, because West Germany was the Federal German Republic, or the Federal Republic of Germany, and then East Germany was the German Democratic Republic. Which one was democratic? In Korea, South Korea is the Republic of Korea. North Korea is the People's Democratic Republic of Korea. So again, you can ask the AfD, which one is democratic of those two? We could talk about this for a while. I do want to move on to a slightly different issue, though, which is why Elon Musk is focusing so much energy on Europe. Obviously, been tweeting 40 times a day about Britain, now getting really, really close to the AfD and backing them in public. Now, the most obvious explanation, really, is that he's boosting the far right in Europe because he is genuinely very, very far right. This is an ideological thing. So from Elon Musk's Twitter, it's pretty clear that he's a white nationalist, right? He grew up in apartheid South Africa, so that also checks out. That makes sense how he might have come to this position. And if your aim is to defend so-called white civilization, which is what all of these right-wingers on Twitter like to talk about, it's obvious why agitation against immigration in Europe might become your obsession, right? You want to keep Europe white. It's the home of white people. Is this why Elon Musk is so obsessed? Just because he's an out-and-out racist, basically. Now, I think this is clearly a big part of why Musk does what he does. I don't think he's pretending to be a white supremacist. I think he is one. But there is also a potential business case as to why Elon Musk wants to bring down centrist European governments. Namely, the Europeans are hoping to compete with his satellite network. So it's called Starlink, and Bloomberg reported in December that the European Union is committed to build an $11 billion constellation of satellites that will provide the bloc with encrypted global internet connectivity. And they report this: the EU is concerned about becoming dependent on a private service after militaries across the world showed interest in Starlink's applications. The plan, which will be carried out through a public-private partnership, aims for IRIS-2 to be a European-operated alternative to third-party actors. So Starlink, run by SpaceX, owned by Elon Musk. The EU want to build a competitor. The article is clear that Elon Musk doesn't have to worry too much in the short term because the EU project will have a difficult time catching up with Starlink. So Musk currently controls 6,000 satellites. The EU project is hoping to have 290 by 2030, although they might be a little bit further out into space, apparently. The project, though, can be viewed as a bit of a statement of intent. So the CEO of one of the companies working on the EU-backed project told Bloomberg this: there is this narrative in the industry that Starlink has won and everyone else is dead, right? That's not true. They invest a lot of money, so they are very difficult to compete with. However, every country and every nation wants to have sovereignty and independence. Even small countries are looking to launch a satellite. Now, the reason the Europeans seem very concerned about this is because the strategic importance of Starlink satellites became very apparent to them after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So you might remember at the start of the war, Elon Musk was helping the Ukrainians. That was by providing their army with access to internet satellite, or to his internet satellite network. But then Musk angered Ukrainians when SpaceX limited access to Starlink for use for Ukrainian drones. So he said, you can use the internet for this, but not that. Now, regardless of your views on the rightness or the wrongness of that decision, so I think it concerned drones in Crimea. Now, you might think that, you might have different opinions on whether it's a good idea for Ukraine to be using military drones in Crimea, but that's not really the issue here. The issue is the amount of power that this gives to one private man, one private individual who owns this company, who can basically make massive geopolitical decisions. And that's something about which former German Chancellor Angela Merkel has publicly expressed concern about. So in November last year, she was promoting her book, And she said this to Der Spiegel magazine. So she said, there is now a visible alliance between Trump, she's talking about, with the big companies from Silicon Valley, which have enormous power through capital. If a person like Musk is the owner of 60% of all satellites orbiting in space, then that must be a huge concern for us. Along with the political issues, politics must determine the social balance between the powerful and ordinary citizens. And she says, during the 2008 financial crisis, the political sphere was the final authority that could straighten things out. And if this final authority is too strongly influenced by companies, whether through capital power or technological capabilities, then this is an unprecedented challenge for us all. And so she's really worried about one individual having this much power. And of course, Merkel, she was German Chancellor for 16 years. She's pretty much the embodiment of the European centrist establishment. And so you can see why Musk might prefer a more right-wing alternative, right? Why he might prefer the AfD to having the Social Democrats or the Christian Democrats in power in Germany, which is, of course, the most powerful country in Europe. So far, at least as well, and this is significant, where the far right are in power in Europe, they have already been very helpful to Elon Musk. We know this because just as the EU announced it was trying to build an alternative to SpaceX and Starlink, Italy, which is of course run by Giorgia Meloni, has signed a $1.6 billion deal with SpaceX. Right? The news broke the day after Meloni met with Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago. Aaron, what's your read on this situation? So I think, clearly, as I say, I think the ideology matters here, but it is also the case that in sort of Elon Musk's plan for world domination, as it seems, sort of the centrist European establishment could be a bit of a barrier to him getting absolutely everything he wants.
I think that's right. I think also people forget that the European Union plus the UK, Europe as a whole, is a huge market. It's 500 million people. The US, I think, is about 350 million. If you look at GDP by PPP, so you're adjusting for the value of the domestic currency, the economy of the EU, is broadly the same as the economy by GDP of the US. So it's a huge market. People like to talk about decline and it not doing very well, or true. You know, Europe isn't producing particularly large technology companies. Spotify is one exception. SAP in Germany is another. But, you know, in California alone, you have, $4 trillion plus companies. Europe is not producing those companies, but it's still a very large, wealthy market. And I think the likes of Musk, but also Zuckerberg, Bezos, look at it as critical. You know, what really stood out for me, actually, Michael, this week was when Mark Zuckerberg announced that volte-face with regards to Trump. And he was saying, we will work alongside the presidency to ensure that, you know, the Europeans don't get away with that. Anti-innovation measures basically means, don't you dare apply tariffs or regulation which might undermine our business model. So all of a sudden, despite Elon Musk being viewed as something of the outside of the bad guy in Silicon Valley, it's clear that that's changing. And I suspect people like Musk, Zuckerberg rather, Bezos, Larry Ellison, they start to think, well, Europe, there's lots of money that can be made. Larry Ellison's thinking, well, look, if we can digitize their health records, the AI applications that come out of that, Oracle is going to make a hell of a lot of money. Jeff Bezos is looking at Amazon, not just with regards to its warehousing, but also with regards to its web services. Meta has 101 products there. Well, we want nice regulations and a nice regulatory environment for self-driving cars and Waymo. So all of a sudden, you have 4, 5, 6, 7 companies in the US. Forget who the president is. Right now, they align. That's the dangerous thing. You have 4, 5, 6 companies in the US who actually look at Europe really as not a sovereign place. It doesn't have technological sovereignty, that's for sure. But they're basically thinking, oh, maybe it shouldn't have political and economic sovereignty either. That is really worrying. And I don't think enough Europeans understand how bad this is. This hasn't just started. You know, it's quite amusing. You've got the Europeans now saying, well, we should have our own satellites. By the way, I wrote a piece in 2019 saying that we should, it was in the Versailles blog, saying that we should have a space-based 5G internet. That should be a project for socialists, that a France led by Mélenchon and a Britain led by Corbyn, they could pay for it. The numbers involved aren't that big when you actually look at the value added. I published that in 2019. People were laughing at me. People were laughing at me because there was this ridiculous space-based internet. We need to think as big as the oligarchs. We need to think as big as the capitalists. If people on the European left are incapable of thinking as big, as the corporate 1% in the United States, we're finished. We're over. We're done. We will have an eternal transfer of wealth and value across the Atlantic every day, week, month, year for the rest of my life. So we have a duty to think big, not just for ourselves, but also for our children, our children's children. We have to. So, the Europeans are late to the game. I'm happy they're there saying this kind of stuff. But actually, this goes far beyond, satellites, Michael. We're talking right now on YouTube. People are watching. Great. Alphabet, US company. On the way here, I used contactless on the tube. Guess what I used? Apple Pay. If I didn't use Apple Pay, it would have been Visa. If it wasn't Visa, it would have been MasterCard. Every single one of those transactions sees a tiny amount of money go across the Atlantic. By the way, that's an argument for a publicly owned payment system. Again, if you said that 5 years ago, stupid left winger. What? It's smart, it's prudent to have loads of money just constantly going over to the US? Is that what we want to do? Again, walk down a high street, every new business, it's a cutesy little cafe or whatever, it's probably being funded by private equity. And if you look at the people involved, actually many of those people are US based. Or if you look at Labour's own growth strategy and how to build infrastructure, they're talking about people like BlackRock being at the center of it. US-centric wealth management, private equity, with their open-ended asset funds, in the case of BlackRock asset managers. That apparently is the path in this country to prosperity and success. No, it is about Europe falling deeper and deeper and deeper into technological, economic, political, social, cultural subservience and subordination to the United States. It doesn't have to be like that, by the way. It doesn't have to be like that. I don't mean to wax lyrical, but this is the continent that gave the world Da Vinci, Darwin, Newton, Pascal, Pasteur. We could go on and on. Galileo, Aristotle. The idea that, we can't do anything because we're so fucking useless. We need some $1 trillion companies in California to do it for us. What a pathetic place to be in. And I'll also finish on this, Michael. There is an alternative that's not just about Europe, right? If we're talking about being this clientelist dependency on somewhere else, hey, there's also China. There was a Ben Shapiro tweet a few days ago sort of saying, the Atlantic is this anti-European moat. We're going to colonize Canada. We're going to take Greenland. Why do Europeans have to take this shit? What are we getting out of this deal? You tell me what we're getting out of this deal. If the alternative is, actually, you normalize relations with Venezuela, cheap oil. You normalize relations with Iran, cheap gas. You normalize relations with China, cheap electric vehicles, functional 5G, high-speed rail. No, I don't think we should just completely, allow all that stuff here. We want our own domestic industries in Europe, of course, too. But if those are the options, dependency on the US or China, actually, there's probably a bit more to it than just, picking that one. If they're just going to basically parasitize our economies more and more every year for the rest of our lives. Michael, it sounds like quite a bad deal. That's why people like Elon Musk now are looking at these clientelistic relationships with European leaders on the radical right. And I think, it's partly ideological, but he's also seeing a political opportunity. And it's a real one, right? We could see the AfD come into government in February, if not then, in 2029. Geert Wilders, his party is the largest party in the Netherlands. He's not the prime minister. Their polling is higher now than it was in the last election. You've obviously got Maloney. Vox are on the rise in Spain. Reform in UK. You could go on and on and on and on. And this is a business opportunity for the likes of Musk. I really believe that. They may believe the stuff they're saying as well, but first and foremost, it's about dollar signs coming in their eyes like Scrooge McDuck.
Yeah, you've highlighted sort of the dependent relationship of Europe on the United States and how that leaves us vulnerable to a situation such as this. The thing I was thinking about, especially with this, was sort of the vulnerability of also the United States to this individual Elon Musk, right? And this is one situation where I think the Democratic Party in some way snookered itself, because one of the reasons why to be honest, the main reason why Elon Musk controls 60% of the satellites in space is because Obama, when he was president, opened up space travel to private industries by signing billion-dollar contracts with SpaceX. So instead of NASA sort of doing the next generation of rockets and the next generation of satellites, they decided to pay SpaceX to do it for them. And, in the short term, that might have made space travel cheaper than it otherwise would have been, right? It does seem like SpaceX has been a remarkably productive company. But over the longer term, it means that you've given this one individual so much control over, geopolitics, could be geoengineering, could be all sorts of things, where this one guy owns 60% of the satellites. And now that might have been a situation that Obama could tolerate when back then Elon Musk was a Democrat who was giving money to the Obama campaign, or at least, the Obama presidential campaign. I'm not sure who he sort of was for in the primaries. But then this very volatile individual, when he switches to Donald Trump and starts to use all of his powerful infrastructure against the liberal establishment, then, maybe we shouldn't have done that, right? Maybe we shouldn't have made so much critical infrastructure reliant on the whim of this one unstable individual, which is what we've done. I do find this very scary that this guy is now in the White House, richest man in the world, controls 60% of satellites, is actively trying to intervene in European politics. And it was in the Financial Times and a bunch of newspapers, wasn't it, that he's told people he wants to bring down Keir Starmer, right? This is a very dangerous situation, I think. From broken temperature records to massive wildfires, it's been a pretty grim week in terms of climate news. Let's start with the most immediately dramatic development we've seen this week, the wildfires in Los Angeles. This is part of a report from Channel 4 News.
It is genuinely difficult to assimilate, to take in the sheer scale of it all at dawn this morning. Landscape to ashscape, where the affluent idyll of Pacific Palisades used to be. But it all begins last night.
Multiple wildfires raging out of control tonight, fueled by hurricane-force winds. The fire in the Pacific Palisades, now the most destructive in the city's history.
The power has been cut off, but the night is still bright on the drought-stricken tinder-dry hills around Los Angeles. The people have gone. Mandatory evacuation.
It's like Armageddon. When you can see the flames coming up over the houses and you're just getting out of the driveway and the smoke and the ash is so thick, I'm surprised all of us got out of there without burning up ourselves.
The luxurious coastal housing of Pacific Palisades burned through the night.
We have a line of fire along the Santa Monica Mountains.
Dan, you've seen a few fires. Ever seen anything on this scale in LA?
This is the worst one for me. Worst one I've ever seen.
No question.
No question.
That was the first shot in that report. If you're listening to the podcast, it was just house after house after house. Every single one of them turned to ash. Like it looked like after the Great Fire of London or something. It's not an image I've seen very often. If those visuals, though, didn't get you worried about the climate, perhaps this might. It's the news which landed today that in 2024, the world breached 1.5 degrees of average warming for the first calendar year ever. The announcement comes from the European Copernicus Observation Agency, whose director said, quote, "Honestly, I am running out of metaphors to explain the warming we are seeing," unquote. Given the lack of suitable metaphors, though, we could just turn to some images. This chart from the BBC shows how global average temperatures have compared to the pre-industrial average each year since 1940. As you can see, it goes up dramatically from 1980 and has increased in a pretty much straight line since then. Not a happy graph. On the political and economic side, there also isn't much good news. So yesterday, the world's largest asset manager, BlackRock, withdrew from the industry group committed to net zero. Also yesterday, Volkswagen, who are Europe's biggest car makers, announced they had produced fewer electric vehicles in 2024 than 2023. So they're going backwards, putting EU emissions targets for the car industry in doubt. Now, with all this going on, I thought it would be a good time to catch up with climate scientist and friend of the show, Dr. Ella Gilbert. I began by asking Ella about the significance of this confirmation that 2024 was 1.5 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels.
This isn't the first time we've seen 12 months in a row of temperatures above 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial, but it is the first calendar year. So that is a landmark in that sense. We know that the Paris Climate Agreement target is 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. This isn't quite apples and apples here, because the Paris Climate Agreement is more of an average over several decades, so 20 years or so, whereas this is just 1 year above that very important threshold. It doesn't take away from the fact that we are rapidly changing our climate. And in fact, we're about 1.25, 1.3 degrees on average over 20 years at the moment. And it is already causing really significant and devastating effects. You just have to look at the headlines, what's happening in LA, for example, to see the sorts of impacts that climate change of 1.3 degrees is already having.
Let's talk about those wildfires in LA and in terms of, how they relate to climate change. I assume, the most basic explanation in terms of climate change seems to be it's hotter, therefore the forests are drier and burn a bit easier. I know also, on the news, they keep talking about high winds, but I imagine it's more the sort of heat and dryness that's climate related than the winds. Can you talk about sort of how it relates to climate change?
So what we normally see in summer wildfires is this combination of heat and dry conditions and then some kind of spark that produces wildfires. What's actually happening in LA at the moment is that you've got really dry conditions. So about 3/5 of California is abnormally dry at the moment. Plus, you've also got this kind of perfect storm of weather conditions happening. So you've got these Santa Ana winds, which are mountain winds. I actually studied them in Antarctica as a kind of side note, but they are really hot and really dry and they're really fast. So you've got really gusty winds that are fanning the flames and making them spread much, much further than they ordinarily would. So climate change is a sort of big picture backdrop, if you like. So it's making the ground drier, also basically providing more fuel because there's lots of shrubs and trees and bushes and things that have dried out, which means there's lots more to burn. And then, of course, you also have the weather picture on top of that, which is adding together to create the really devastating scenes that we're seeing.
We get you on often when there's sort of a dramatic flood. And the explanation I understand in my head is that when it's warmer, more water evaporates from the sea or wherever. And that actually means that there's sort of more rain in the clouds because more water evaporates. So it might be warmer, but it also comes with more wet weather. But the forests in California are drier. I know this is just too complicated for my simple mind, but can you kind of explain how these things all relate to each other?
In simplest terms, climate change just extremifies the extremes. So it makes them drier when they're dry, or hotter when they're hot, or wetter when they're wet. And it intensifies the hydrological cycle. So intensifies the water cycle, which means that when you have downpours, you have absolute deluges. And when you have drought conditions, you have really prolonged drought conditions. And the changes caused by climate change are not uniform everywhere. So in some places, it might cause a drying out. For example, Southern California. In other places, it might cause a wettening. So like the UK, for instance. And these changes are not the same all over the planet. And you can see two things that seem to be completely polar opposites happening in different places.
The conversation on climate change mitigation we'll get onto in one moment. Adaptation is always the other issue whenever we see these sort of extreme weather events. When it comes to wildfires, what's the kind of adaptation? I mean, there's probably nowhere in the world better able to sort of fund adaptation measures than Los Angeles in the United States, right? What would they be doing? Is it better forest management? Is it more fire engines? I mean, what would adaptation look like in this context?
Yeah, I think it's a really important part of the question because, of course, you have to reduce emissions, but at the same time, you have to plan and prepare for the changes that are to come. And I mean, they already do have lots of management plans in place. And that's evidenced by the fact that they have a system for getting word out. There's an evacuation order system, and people do adhere to them, rightly so, because you can imagine how much worse it would have been if people didn't have those kinds of evacuation orders in place. But, we're going to have to adapt because wildfires are going to happen more frequently in future. California is already a place that knows how to deal with wildfires. It's not something that's come completely out of the blue. However, the fact of the matter is that they're already stretched with resources. This is the most severe wildfire they've seen in a really, really long time. And there just aren't really the resources to keep dealing with these sorts of fires year after year. And this is happening in winter, whereas actually usually the wildfires are strongest in summer. So adaptation has to happen, and people need to start thinking about where they're building buildings, what they're building them of, how to manage the forest, as you say, how to deal with those sorts of questions. And I don't have the answer for that, but I'm sure people who do work on this would have something maybe more sensible to say.
You're not an expert on forest management. You're an expert on many other things, which is good enough for me. I want to talk about the broader issue when it comes to sort of how we think about climate change. So 2024, as has just been confirmed today, was the first calendar year where temperatures were above 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. We've also seen all of these extreme weathers hitting, including the United States. Also, there were lots of headlines at the end of last year saying 2024, the year of the climate backlash. So you had lots of electoral movements that were climate skeptical, that were against net zero, that did quite well. And I suppose, on the face of it, this doesn't look very good. And I wondered if you think it's sort of, we need a new strategy when it comes to what we're going to do, sort of as a society, with reference to runaway climate change.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. I mean, climate scientists have been raising the alarm with increasing levels of shrillness for decades, since probably before I was born, in fact. And it hasn't really got us very far so far. And it's very fair to argue that we should adopt a different approach. I don't know what that approach would be. And if you have any suggestions, I'm all ears, because it's clearly not working. We are not doing enough. We're not doing it fast enough. Political movements, political parties, people in general are not waking up to this really, quite frankly, terrifying situation with anywhere close to the speed that we need to. And it's really difficult to kind of turn a very slow moving ship around and to actually encourage people and society in general to change in such a wholehearted and comprehensive way, even if ultimately the goal would mean that things might be better for everyone in the long run. It's very difficult to change things from the way they are. And yeah, I don't have the answer, unfortunately.
I don't claim to have the answer, but I do have a suggestion. And I'm not a climate scientist, so I always say my level of confidence here is quite low. But I'm wondering whether it's sort of time for, in the same way that sort of scientists and social scientists, you look at sort of nature as a somewhat immovable object, in the way that you can't just wish for the laws of nature to be different. I feel that there is an element to which we maybe need to look at sort of political and economic reality, at least in the short term, sort of the timescale we're looking at when it comes to climate change, a bit more like that, not completely like that, but a bit more like that. Because one of the ways I think sort of people look at this is to say, well, that the technology is there. We don't really need much more technology, because all we need is for political institutions to do what we want them to do. And I feel maybe it's time to sort of say, well, we've got quite a lot of evidence now to suggest that political institutions aren't going to do exactly what we want them to do, which isn't just because they're corrupt. It's also because it's hard to sell this kind of thing to electorates. China, India, they want to develop. And I wonder if you come from that approach, which is, yes, what we'd love is for governments to do exactly what we want them to do, but that's not going to happen. Let's look at different, potentially more experimental ways of dealing with this. And I'm very interested in solar radiation management. So the idea that, could we put a bunch of sulfur in the higher stratosphere to try and reduce global warming? And to explain this, I mean, you might disagree with me here, but as far as I understand, one reason why climate scientists think that global warming is happening faster than we had previously expected it to is because actually we reduced sulfur pollution, which has meant that more of the sun's energy gets through into our atmosphere. So we sort of reduced it for a good reason, because it was causing people lung problems and causing acid rain, but it's had a negative consequence of warming the planet more. Solar radiation management, you could put it a little bit higher than it goes when it's sort of not naturally, but sort of reduced or emitted from industrial processes. So you could have the good parts of sulfur dioxide, which is it blocks out bits of the sun, without the bad parts, which is that it can cause acid rain or damage our lungs. What do you think about solar radiation management?
I'm going to get to that, but just one very quick point before. I think, yeah, as you said, it's a political question. And ultimately, the climate science community, we're scientists, we're not the people to be deciding on political questions. And I think this comes actually quite nicely to your solar radiation management question. Climate change is a geoengineering experiment. We have geoengineered our climate. We have changed our climate because of our actions. And to fix that by geoengineering our way out of it, I think could be quite risky. I mean, it's not to say that what we're doing is not already risky, But we don't necessarily know all of the facts about solar radiation management. Stratospheric aerosol injection, which is what you're describing, is probably one of the more sensible and better researched solutions. But there are pretty wacky other options, like putting curtains under the Antarctic ice sheet, or putting mirrors in space. All of those quite out there suggestions. It sort of distracts from the main problem or the main solution, which is to stop burning fossil fuels at such alarming regularity. And there are things that we should do first before we start injecting tiny little particles, which we don't know exactly how they're going to behave, into the atmosphere.
I think that's a very interesting answer, because I suppose this is where and as I say, I'm speaking with very low confidence here, but when I think about sort of the scientific community's role on this, as you say, it's not their job to do politics, it's their role to do science. But I feel like there has been resistance to sort of do the kind of experimentation we would need on geoengineering, so we have a bit more certainty. And when it comes to solar radiation management, for example, or stratospheric aerosol injection, as you called it, there's been a resistance to do that because they think it will give an excuse for the politicians not to do the simpler thing, which is just to stop emissions. But if we realize, or if we sort of accept, and I'm speaking with low confidence here, but if one were to accept that actually that's really difficult, it's not easy to say, politicians, you follow this advice, you just reduce emissions. If that's really difficult, then the sort of it's a distraction argument begins to go out the window, and maybe it's time for scientists to sort of put more effort into researching this stuff instead of being, I think, quite skeptical and sometimes resisting researching it. What do you make of that?
This is a very, very topical point, actually, because I think this conversation has been raging in the community for, quite a long time, several years. And I think things are starting to change, or at least that's my interpretation. It used to be, oh no, it's a distraction. Anyone who researches geoengineering is kind of wacky. I think that is starting to shift, actually. And I think there's a lot of people starting to take the approach of yes and that we should, maybe it doesn't mean we're going to pursue those geoengineering solutions, but certainly it's important to know the risks and the rewards that would hypothetically be associated with them were we to implement them. So what is going to happen if we do this particular strategy? And to basically, it gives you all of the options, right? It allows you to go into decision making with your eyes wide open instead of going, I guess this might happen, but we have to try it now. I think one fairly compelling argument that someone gave me was, we don't want to get to the point where we have to deploy these kinds of solutions and not know what will happen. It would be better, of course, to pursue all of the emissions reductions and the adaptation plans alongside. And then if you have to start to do geoengineering techniques, then you should know what's going to happen when you do them. I don't think it's an easy question, but I think there's much more research at the moment going into these sorts of solutions, and certainly more than it used to be, 15 years ago. It's much less fringe now.
That was Ella Gilbert speaking to me earlier today. Aaron, I was pleased that geoengineering in the scientific community less fringe now than it used to be. What did you make of that interview?
Well, less fringe after our Barney, 6 weeks ago, was it now? 2 months ago?
I'm not sure if that's what's the explanation as to why the scientists at the UN have decided that it's time to do some proper research into
mainstreamed it.
Solar radiation.
I'll say quickly, look, I think the point that Ella made about costs and benefits is a really good one. if there is an extreme weather event which kills tens of millions of people, then I think people will start to say, well, actually, there's a huge downside to what we're doing here. What we do to remediate things or mitigate them in the hyper short term, which is, I think that would be the set of conditions under which you might start to see people talking seriously about geoengineering. Fortunately, that hasn't happened. Hopefully, it never happens. But it's not implausible. I think if you see very, very extreme weather events killing lots of people, all of a sudden there's a political impetus to do something very quickly. That doesn't mean you discard the other stuff as well, the longer term stuff. I think something like 9% of all CO2 come from concrete and cement, Michael. If you can decarbonize that, huge. Aviation, 3%. If you can halve that, big deal. If you can, decarbonize transport generally and building, you're looking at, double digits in both cases. So there is lots that can be done, but that will take a very long time, and it'll take lots of political will. And you're right, frankly, they're both in short supply. The counter argument made against geoengineering, Michael, I think it's a very compelling one. Really goes back to the idea of the Jevons paradox, 19th century British economist. He said that even as steam engines get more efficient, people use more and more coal. And this applies to commodity after commodity. And suppose the argument here is, well, once we work out how to geoengineer the environment, the incentives mean you just double down on fossil fuel consumption, which I think would be tremendously dangerous for a bunch of reasons, not least that things like nuclear, solar, wind, geothermal are just, if you get the technology right, immeasurably more abundant and cheaper to do in the long term than hydrocarbons. Much less dangerous as well, right? If you look at, for instance, gas being used as a means of cooking and heating inside homes, it's one of the leading causes of global deaths today in 2024. It's right up there. It is air pollution, particularly, like I say, open fires in a constrained area. It still kills many, many people in the global south. So there are massive incentives to decarbonize energy supplies, food systems, built environment. And I think that's probably the best counter argument against this stuff, Michael, is you kind of flip those incentives if you do engineering and it works, right? In a way, worst case scenario, it works really well. It works too well. It works so well, people stop bothering with that stuff. And I think that is a fair argument. The future has to be a world beyond hydrocarbons.
Agree, the future has to be a world beyond hydrocarbons. I also don't think anyone's doubting that geoengineering comes with massive risks. But I mean, I ultimately at this point think it's going to be inevitable because we're seeing heating at such high sort of speeds and emissions going down quite slowly. I think it's going to happen. I think the sort of prompt for it will be some extreme weather event that lasts for a while, a bit like the beginning of the Ministry for the Future when there's sort of a drought or a heat wave, isn't there, in India that kills 20 million people, and then the Indians go and inject the sulfur dioxide themselves. I think it would make sense to do a lot of this research now instead of finding out that it's sort of, we're doing it with much lower degrees of certainty than we could otherwise have. And I think the idea that it's a distraction overestimates how far we're going to go to decarbonisation without geoengineering work. I think there's a lot of optimism about politics there. But we won't rehearse all of these arguments. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Michael, one word, China. I hope all they're doing very good things. Xi's doing great things on post-carbon technology, Michael. Anyway, everyone watching and listening, have a great weekend.
I'm sure Xi Jinping is a plan of solar radiation management. I would imagine. They're also building shed loads of coal with their solar power, but there we are. Let's wrap up. Have a fantastic weekend, everyone. We'll be back on Monday at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.